What if the school bully picked on the wrong girl, one with a connection so powerful it could change everything? This is the story of Layla Parker, a soft-spoken transfer student whose life takes an unexpected turn when she crosses paths with Dylan Matthews, the most feared guy at Northfield High in Dallas, Texas. He saw her as just another easy target, unassuming, probably too scared to push back. What he didn't know was that Layla had a secret that would flip the script in a way no one could have predicted. Stay with this story until the end, because what starts with a bully's ego will end with a lesson he'll never forget. Layla stepped off the school bus that morning, gripping the worn straps of her faded backpack as she stared at the towering glass and brick facade of Northfield High. The air still carried the leftover warmth from a Texas summer, even though October had already crept onto the calendar. Clusters of students lingered near the entrance, laughing, swapping weekend stories, and scrolling through their phones like any normal Monday. But for Layla, it felt like she'd stepped onto another planet. This wasn't her first time being the new girl. In fact, it was her third school transfer in just 2 years. Some kids moved because their parents got promoted, relocated for work, or chased some new adventure. Layla moved for one reason: a clean slate. Again. Keeping her head low, she walked toward the double doors, mentally preparing herself to go unnoticed. A few students glanced her way, curious maybe, but she didn't return their looks. Northfield was like every other suburban high school she'd passed through, predictable in its social structure. Football players ruled the hallways, cheerleaders owned the cafeteria, and kids like Layla kept to the edges, hoping to survive unnoticed. That was her plan: stay invisible, stay safe. Inside, the school buzzed with its typical morning chaos. Lockers slammed shut, sneakers squeaked on polished tile floors. Teachers shouted last-minute reminders before the bell rang. Layla clutched her schedule tighter, scanning room numbers, mentally mapping her first day like she'd done before. Step 1, find her locker. Step 2, scope out a quiet corner for lunch. Step 3, identify who to avoid at all costs. That's when she saw him. Dylan Matthews. He stood near the science wing, tall and broad-shouldered, oozing the kind of cocky charm only guys like him could pull off. Surrounded by a half-circle of guys in varsity jackets, Dylan laughed at something one of them said, flashing that grin that probably got him out of more trouble than it should have. Even from where she stood, Layla could sense the tension in the air around him, the nervous way his friends laughed too loud, the way they shifted uncomfortably when he moved too close. She'd seen this before. The untouchable golden boy, star quarterback, local hero. The one teachers excused, girls chased, and everyone else feared. Dylan wasn't just popular. He controlled the room without saying much at all. Layla recognized the type. She'd met his kind at her last school, and the one before that. Her only goal was to keep her distance. Blend in, disappear behind textbooks and lockers. But luck wasn't on her side that day. As she walked past, someone clipped her shoulder hard. It wasn't an accident. Her books and folders scattered across the floor, papers skimming across the hallway tiles like fallen leaves. A few students slowed to watch, some snickered. Layla crouched quickly, heart pounding, ignoring the burn in her face as she scrambled to gather her things. And then she heard it. "Well, well, what do we have here?" She froze. That voice, steady, low, dripping with mock amusement, belonged to Dylan Matthews. Layla didn't need to look up to confirm. She could already hear his friends laughing softly behind him. But she did look up anyway, because that's what fighters do. And there he was standing over her, arms crossed, wearing that arrogant smirk. The kind that said he thought he owned the hallway, the school, the world. "I don't think I've seen you around before," Dylan said, like he was toying with her already. "You knew?" Layla didn't answer. She grabbed her books off the floor, straightened up, and brushed past Dylan without saying a word. But Dylan wasn't about to let it slide. "Hey, where's your manners?" he called out, loud enough for half the hallway to hear. "I asked you a question." Layla kept moving. She'd played this game before, in schools just like this one. The fastest way to deal with people like him was to not give them the reaction they wanted. But Dylan didn't like being ignored. That's when she felt it, a sudden yank on her backpack. Not hard enough to hurt her, but just enough to make a point. Just enough to let her know that he wasn't done. Layla stopped in her tracks. For a second, the entire hallway seemed to freeze. Even the students who hadn't been paying attention before now turned to watch. She slowly turned to face him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, something flickered behind Dylan's grin. Confusion, maybe even curiosity. "You really shouldn't have done that," Layla said, her voice low but steady. Dylan raised an eyebrow, then let out a slow, mocking laugh. "Oh yeah. And why's that?" A few of his friends snickered behind him. Layla didn't answer. She just held her ground, staring back at him with the kind of calm that unsettles people used to being in control. Dylan tilted his head like he was studying her. "You're kind of strange, you know that." More laughs from his friends. Layla turned back around and walked away without another word. She didn't need to look back to know this wasn't over. And Dylan, he had no clue how badly he'd just miscalculated. The rest of the day blurred by. Layla stayed quiet, sitting at the back of every classroom, only speaking when directly called on. She kept her head down, avoided eye contact, and spent lunch at the far edge of the cafeteria, tucked into a corner near the emergency exit. Dylan and his crew held court in the middle of the lunchroom, loud and reckless, like always. Every so often she could feel his gaze shift toward her, but he didn't approach. Not yet. By the time the final bell rang, Layla couldn't get out of the building fast enough. The late afternoon heat pressed down on the sidewalk, the air thick and heavy as she made her way toward the bus stop. Just as she reached into her pocket for her phone, she heard it. His voice again. "New girl." She turned. There he was. Dylan Matthews. Hands stuffed casually in his jacket pockets, that same irritating grin stretched across his face. A couple of his friends lingered a few feet behind, watching. Layla let out a soft sigh. "What do you want?" Dylan stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "You've got an attitude problem, you know that?" She didn't answer. His grin grew wider. "You think you're better than me?" Layla let out a small laugh. Not nervous, not afraid, just amused. That threw him for a second. She said slowly, "That you should walk away." Dylan's smile faltered for just a heartbeat before he caught himself. "Is that right?" He stepped in, close enough to cast a shadow over her. "And why exactly would I do that?" Layla leaned in just enough for only him to hear. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Because you really don't know who I am." Dylan blinked. Then she took a step back, pulled out her phone, and with one deliberate motion, tapped a single button on the screen. A loud, roaring engine filled the air. A deep growl of horsepower echoed down the street as a sleek black Dodge Charger Hellcat pulled up beside the sidewalk, the kind of car that made everyone turn their heads on instinct. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside, but when the glass lowered with a slow, almost theatrical hum, there he was. The Rock. Dylan's trademark smirk evaporated in less than a second. Layla turned back toward him, and for the first time that day, a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Still think I'm weird?" she asked softly. Dylan didn't answer. For once, the guy who always had something clever to say was completely speechless. Layla watched as the usual confidence drained from his face. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes flicked nervously between her and the unmistakable figure sitting behind the wheel of that Charger. The air shifted. The smug energy Dylan wore like a jacket all day long was suddenly gone. He stumbled a half-step backward. His friends, who'd been lingering like backup dancers in his personal ego parade, now exchanged uneasy glances, none of them brave enough to crack a joke or break the silence. Meanwhile, Layla stayed exactly where she was, taking her time. She adjusted the strap of her backpack like she had all the time in the world, then let out a slow, steady breath, as if this entire power shift wasn't even fazing her. The Rock didn't say a word at first. He just sat there with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, but the look he gave Dylan was anything but casual. It was the kind of stare that carried history, discipline, and a level of intimidation that no high school quarterback could fake his way through. Dylan's Adam's apple bobbed visibly. "Hold on a second," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for anyone but himself to hear, as if he needed to convince himself this wasn't really happening. His voice, usually cocky and dripping with arrogance, now cracked at the edges. For the first time since their hallway run-in that morning, he actually looked at Layla. Not glanced. Really saw her. Like he was finally trying to put together a puzzle that should have been obvious from the start. Layla leaned in just enough for her voice to land like a secret between them. "Still think I'm just some random girl?" she said, her tone low and deliberate. Dylan opened his mouth, but whatever words he was searching for never made it past his throat. The Rock spoke. "Let's go, kid," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably final. It wasn't a question. Layla didn't hesitate. Without giving Dylan or anyone else another glance, she walked right past him, moving through the small crowd that had started gathering like a ripple effect down the hallway. Whispers followed her, wide eyes trailed her steps, but she kept going. She pulled open the passenger door and climbed in, shutting it behind her with a soft but certain click. The Rock shifted the car into drive, and the engine let out a low, threatening rumble. Within seconds, the Charger rolled away from the curb, leaving behind a school's worth of stunned faces and hushed conversations that would probably last for weeks. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out around them, the late afternoon sun streaking gold and amber across the dashboard. Buildings blurred past the window. Layla tapped her fingers lightly against her knee, slowly releasing the tension she'd been carrying since the first bell rang that morning. The Rock kept his gaze steady on the road ahead, his hand tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the steering wheel like he wasn't even fazed. After a few quiet minutes, he asked, "You good?" Layla gave a short nod. Then, after a pause, let out a dry little laugh. "That was a little dramatic, huh?" A knowing smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth, just enough to let her know he was proud, but still, the Rock-level cool about it. Layla shook her head, smiling to herself as she watched the streets roll by. "I didn't exactly plan for them to find out like that." Without taking his eyes off the road, the Rock gave her a sideways glance. "Sometimes life doesn't wait for your plans, kid." "And what would have been a better way? Let some punk like that walk all over you?" Layla let out a slow breath, letting her head fall back against the car seat. "I wasn't going to let him walk over me," she murmured, staring at the roof of the Charger. "I was just waiting." The Rock glanced at her, one eyebrow rising. "Waiting for what?" She gave a half shrug, the ghost of a smirk playing on her lips. "For the right moment." For a second, he stayed quiet. Then a low chuckle rumbled from his chest. "You know, you're starting to sound like me when I was your age." Layla turned her head just enough to look at him, a full smirk now breaking through. "That's a terrifying thought." This time, the Rock laughed, loud, full, and genuine, shaking his head as he steered the Charger down their street. "Smart mouth," he said, but there was pride in his tone. The ride home was comfortable. The tension that had weighed down the air earlier seemed to dissolve with each mile, replaced with the easy banter that only existed between people who understood each other. But just because the drive felt calm didn't mean the problem had disappeared. Layla knew that. Bryce Carter wasn't the kind of guy who took public embarrassment lightly. Even if the sight of the Rock pulling up had rattled him for a moment, fear like that didn't stay fear for long. It turned into something else, something uglier. When they pulled into the driveway of their suburban Houston home, sleek and modern with tall glass windows and a stone walkway, Layla unbuckled her seatbelt, but stayed seated. She didn't move. The Rock noticed. "What's on your mind?" he asked, keeping the engine running for a beat longer. Layla exhaled, fingers twisting the strap of her backpack. "He's not done with me," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the windshield. The Rock studied her for a long second. With that same level-headed calm that had carried him through entire Hollywood fight scenes and real-life boardroom negotiations, he replied, "No, he's not. But you're not done with him either." Her eyes met his, a silent question lingering there. "You think I should fight back?" she asked after a pause. He leaned back, one arm draped lazily over the steering wheel like he had all the time in the world. "I think," he said carefully, "you need to stay ready. Guys like him? They hate losing more than anything." Layla nodded, her resolve settling like stone in her chest. She whispered, "I know." The next morning at school, she expected whispers. What she didn't expect was how loud they would be. The moment she stepped through the doors of Clearview High, it was like walking into a wall of side eyes and murmurs. Groups of students huddled near lockers, heads turning in her direction like clockwork. Some faces held curiosity, others wore amusement, and a few, mostly the ones surrounding Bryce, dripped with open hostility. She spotted them almost instantly. Bryce and his crew posted near the science wing lockers like a low-budget gang from some bad teen movie. Letterman jackets, sneakers dragging, fake bravado on full display. Bryce stood in the center, arms folded across his chest. But this time, there was no smirk, no jokes. Just a steady, unreadable stare fixed right on her. Layla didn't blink, didn't slow her pace. She met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than she needed to, then turned and walked straight toward her first class without breaking stride. The weight of their eyes stayed on her, but she didn't care. If Bryce wanted to escalate, she'd let him. On her terms. By lunch, the tension was impossible to ignore. As she carried her tray across the crowded cafeteria toward an empty table near the windows, one of Bryce's followers, Ryan, a linebacker built like a refrigerator but with half the IQ, decided to make his move. As she passed, Ryan casually stuck out his leg. Layla caught the stumble just in time, her tray jolting but staying mostly upright. A few fries hit the floor, but she didn't fall. The room seemed to freeze for a second. Laughter followed. Low at first, then louder from Bryce's table as Ryan grinned like he'd just won some kind of prize. Layla slowly straightened her tray, carefully setting it back into balance. She stood tall, let out a breath through her nose, and without hesitation, turned toward Ryan. Her voice came out sharp but controlled. "Wow," she said dryly. "I didn't realize cavemen still existed." The cafeteria erupted. A wave of shocked laughter rippled through the nearby tables. Even a few students who normally stayed out of Bryce's drama couldn't hold back. The look on Ryan's face dropped instantly, his smug grin faltering like someone had just cut the power to his brain. Bryce, watching from his seat, tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes as if recalibrating. Like he was reassessing a threat he hadn't taken seriously before. Layla didn't wait for them to come up with a comeback. She turned, walked to her table, sat down, and began eating like none of it mattered. But she knew better. Bryce Carter wasn't done. And by the time that final bell rang at the end of the day, she'd already braced herself for whatever came next. So when Layla opened her locker the next morning to find her books dumped on the floor and crude drawings scrawled across the metal in thick black marker, she wasn't surprised. She stood there for a second, exhaling slowly, leaning her shoulder against the locker next to it. A few students nearby hovered awkwardly, watching like spectators at a slow-motion car crash. None brave enough to help, but all curious enough to stay and see how she'd react. Layla crouched down, gathering her books one by one, stacking them neatly. No shaking hands, no flustered looks, no visible emotion at all. She felt Bryce's stare burning from across the hall, waiting for her to lose it. She gave him nothing. When she was done, she closed the locker door with calm finality and walked away without looking back. And that, more than anything, seemed to rattle him. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly tapping her fingers against the wood grain. The Rock stood leaning against the counter, arms folded, his steady gaze fixed on her like he was trying to read her thoughts. "They trashed my locker today," she finally said, staring at a spot on the table like it owed her an explanation. He lifted an eyebrow. "That's their move?" "Amateur hour." Layla let out a small, humorless laugh. The Rock gave a slow nod. "What's yours?" She sat quietly for a beat, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him curious. Then she gave a half smile, something sharp and knowing. "I'm going to let him bury himself." That earned her a grin. "Now that's what I'm talking about." Layla leaned back in her chair, feeling that familiar sense of control settle deep into her chest like armor. Bryce Carter thought he was running the show, but the truth was, she'd barely started playing. She knew Bryce's type too well. Loud, cocky, always performing for the crowd. Guys like him weren't half as untouchable as they liked to pretend. They were sloppy when pushed, careless when provoked, and Layla had patience to spare. The next morning, She walked through the Clearview High front doors like nothing had happened. The stares came in waves. The whispers were louder now, but different. Yesterday, everyone had been talking about the girl who got picked up by the rock in a muscle car that could eat most student vehicles for breakfast. Today, they were buzzing about what Bryce had done to her locker. And Layla could feel the energy shifting. When people started questioning the king, his throne suddenly felt a lot less sturdy. Bryce was at his usual post, holding court near the lockers, his crew of varsity extras laughing too loud at some dumb joke. But the second she passed by, the conversation wavered. Bryce's eyes flicked toward her, expectant, hungry for any crack in her armor. She gave him nothing. Walked right by, head up, like he didn't even exist. His jaw clenched. By lunch, the pressure in the air felt thick enough to cut. Bryce wasn't built for being ignored. He fed on control, and Layla's silence was more humiliating to him than any insult she could have thrown. So when she stepped into the cafeteria and spotted him sitting at his usual center table, surrounded by his pack of yes-men, she already knew something was coming. Sure enough, as soon as she passed the milk cart, his voice rang out across the room, loud, mocking. "Hey, Layla! You still crying about your little locker incident?" A few kids paused mid-bite. The chatter softened just enough for the insult to echo. Layla didn't even blink. She grabbed her tray, kept walking toward her usual seat like he hadn't said a word, but Bryce wasn't finished. "Guess you're waiting for your big bad daddy to come fight your battles again, huh?" That got more laughs, forced and nervous, but still, it got them. A few of his friends chuckled. Others just exchanged uncertain glances like they weren't sure how far this was going to go. Layla finally set her tray down, turned her head slowly toward him, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables. "It's funny," her tone almost bored. "You keep bringing up my dad. Like you didn't almost wet yourself the second you saw him pull up." The entire cafeteria went still. Someone at the far end let out a strangled cough, trying to hold back a laugh. Bryce's face turned the color of a sunburn, his smirk collapsing under the weight of the room's silence. His friends froze, some shifting awkwardly, others pretending to check their phones like they weren't part of this anymore. Layla didn't break eye contact as she picked up her fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of her food. Bryce stayed frozen in place, and for the first time since walking into Clearview High, Layla felt the balance of power shift entirely in her direction. She wanted him to sit with that feeling. The sting of public humiliation, the awkward weight of vulnerability, because guys like Bryce never knew how to handle becoming the punchline. Bryce's jaw flexed, and though he forced out a laugh, it was brittle, more air than humor. "So that's it?" he sneered loud enough for the cafeteria to hear. "You think you're some kind of badass now? Walking around here like you're better than the rest of us just 'cause some Hollywood superstar picks you up in a flashy car?" His voice cracked toward the end, but he covered it by pushing his shoulders back like he was still in control. Layla tilted her head slightly. She answered simply, "I just don't have anything to prove." And that was the difference. Bryce had spent every day of his life proving he was the strongest, proving he was the one people feared, proving he mattered. Layla didn't need to prove anything. She already knew who she was. That made him furious. She caught it, the exact second Bryce decided this wasn't over. The subtle clench in his fists before he forced them to relax, the tension in his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes. She recognized it for what it was. Escalation. He was going to try something worse. And she was ready. After school, Layla kept her pace slow on purpose as she made her way toward the parking lot. The late afternoon sun burned low, stretching long shadows across the asphalt. She spotted him before she even fully rounded the corner. There he was, propped against the hood of his car like some movie villain, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His friends weren't with him this time. This was one-on-one now. Layla stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Another speech about how I don't belong here?" Bryce exhaled hard through his nose. "Nah," he said, voice quieter than before. "I just got one question." She lifted her chin. "Go ahead." For a moment, Bryce didn't speak. His eyes searched hers like he was trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly felt way too complicated for him. Finally, he asked, "Why don't you fight back? There wasn't mockery in his tone this time. No smugness. Just raw, confused curiosity. Layla blinked, surprised by the shift, then shrugged. Because I don't have to. Bryce let out a sharp scoff, shaking his head like he couldn't process that answer. That's not how this works, he muttered. People like me, we push, and people like you either push back or get flattened. Layla stepped in closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear. People like me wait. We let guys like you keep pushing, keep making bad choices, keep showing everyone exactly how desperate and insecure you really are. And then, when you're knee-deep in your own mess, we don't even have to lift a finger. You've already destroyed yourself. Bryce's stare locked on hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Clearview High, she saw it. Doubt. Real, genuine doubt flashing across his face. He caught it too and tried to recover. You think you've got me all figured out, huh? He said with a dry laugh, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. You don't know a damn thing about me. Layla studied him carefully, unflinching. Maybe not, she said. But I know you're scared. Bryce's whole body stiffened. I'm not scared of you, he snapped. Layla's smile this time was small, but razor sharp. Not of me, she said evenly. You're scared of being irrelevant, of not mattering, of waking up one day and realizing nobody cares who you are unless you're making someone else feel small. Bryce's throat bobbed. His fists curled again. She watched the silent war happening behind his eyes, pride battling fear, ego fighting the truth. He wanted so badly to spit something back, to claw his way out of the corner she'd backed him into. But there was nothing. Nothing he could say that wouldn't prove her right. Layla shook her head slowly. I don't need to fight you, Bryce, she said, turning to leave. You've been fighting yourself this whole time. And just like that, she walked away, shoulders back, head high, without giving him the satisfaction of looking back. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring the ice cubes in her glass, while the Rock leaned against the counter, watching her with that unreadable stare he always had when something important was brewing. Something happened today? He asked finally. Layla didn't look up right away. She said after a pause, with Bryce. The Rock raised an eyebrow. Bad? She thought about it for a second, then gave a small smile. I think I got in his head. That earned her a slow, approving nod. He said simply. Layla let out a long breath, staring at the condensation gathering on her glass. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But she also knew one thing for sure. Bryce Carter wasn't winning anymore. But that didn't mean he was finished. Dwayne studied her for a long second, before moving from where he stood and taking the seat across from her at the kitchen table. Do you want this to be over? He asked, tone low but steady. Alyssa frowned, her fingers drumming softly on the wood. What do you mean? Dwayne leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. You've got enough on him now. One move from you, one push, and he'll fall hard. You could expose him, humiliate him in front of the whole school. You've got more leverage than you think, kid. Alyssa sat quiet for a beat, weighing the option. Finally, she shook her head slowly. She said, voice certain. I want him to be the one who ends it himself. Dwayne cracked a smile, a glimmer of pride flickering in his eyes. Smart, he said simply. Alyssa stretched her arms behind her head with a small smirk. But it's going to take patience. Dwayne chuckled, standing and grabbing a glass of water. Good thing you've got that in spades. And she did. Alyssa could already see it, the unraveling. Bryce had spent weeks pushing, testing her limits, trying to crack her armor. But now, he was the one coming undone. She caught it in the flicker of his eyes whenever she walked into a room. The way he stiffened every time someone said her name. How his jokes fell flat now, followed by awkward glances and forced laughter from friends who weren't sure they wanted to co-sign him anymore. The king of Clearview High was slipping. And then, 2 days later, the final blow landed. Alyssa knew something big had happened the second she stepped onto campus. The energy was different. Whispers followed her from the front gate to the lockers. Groups huddled together, some giggling, others wide-eyed and whispering like they'd just witnessed a car crash in slow motion. Alyssa didn't rush. She just walked toward the crowd that had gathered near Bryce's locker. And there it was. Dozens of sheets of paper taped and layered across his locker door. Screenshots, printed conversations, private messages. Every filthy, cruel, backstabbing thing Bryce had said about people at school. There were texts mocking classmates he pretended to like, cruel jokes at the expense of students struggling with mental health, racist slurs buried in group chats, and disgusting comments about teachers. Some of it so vile that students were literally gasping as they read. But the worst part? The timestamps. They weren't from years ago, they were recent. Very recent. The hallway filled with the sound of phones snapping photos, fingers swiping screens, the low hum of people recording videos. Bryce shoved through the crowd, face drained of color, panic painted across every inch of him. His hands shook as he tore the papers down one by one, each rip more frantic than the last. "What the hell is this?" he barked, spinning in place, his eyes wild. But it was too late. The damage had spread like wildfire. His friends stood frozen nearby, glancing between each other, none of them stepping up. Some were already slinking away, pretending they didn't know him. Others stared at the floor. Across the hall, Alyssa stood with her back to the lockers, arms crossed, watching. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The whole school saw it now. The real Bryce. And he knew exactly who had been waiting for this moment. Bryce's eyes locked onto hers. Gone was the cocky grin. Gone was the arrogance. All that remained was raw, seething rage. "You did this," he hissed, low and shaking. Alyssa tilted her head like she was genuinely considering the accusation. She asked, her tone maddeningly calm. His face twisted. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think this makes you better than me?" Alyssa pushed off the locker and took a slow, deliberate step toward him, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "No, Bryce. This doesn't make me better than you. It just makes you exactly what you are. And now, everyone else knows it too." For a brief second, his fists clenched at his sides like he wanted to swing at her right there in front of the entire school. But he didn't. Because deep down, even he knew, if he laid a hand on her, it would only prove she'd been right all along. Instead of lashing out, Bryce spun on his heel and stormed through the hallway, roughly pushing past anyone unlucky enough to stand in his path. But Alyssa knew. No matter how far he walked, there was no outrunning this. His reign was over. The empire he built on fear and ego had collapsed, and there was no rebuilding it now. That afternoon, when the final bell rang and Alyssa stepped out onto the school steps, she spotted the Rock casually leaning against his black Charger parked along the curb. His signature calm expression was there, but this time there was something extra behind it. Something unmistakably proud. Alyssa slid into the passenger seat, releasing a slow, steady breath like she'd been holding it all day. Dwayne didn't turn the key right away. Instead, he just glanced at her, studying her face. "So, it's over?" he asked, his voice low but knowing. Alyssa nodded. "It's over." He let that hang in the air for a second, then smirked. "And you didn't even have to throw a single punch." Alyssa let out a soft laugh, leaning her head back against the seat. "Didn't need to," she said with a small smile, her voice lighter than it had felt in weeks. Dwayne chuckled, finally turning the key. The deep growl of the Charger's engine rumbled to life beneath them as he eased away from the curb, merging onto the road. "So, what's next for you?" he asked, shooting her a quick side glance. Alyssa paused, thinking for a beat about everything. The exhausting build-up, the doubts, the moments she almost gave in, and the quiet satisfaction of watching Bryce Carter's downfall unfold on its own weight. A slow grin spread across her face as she turned to him. "Now?" she said, eyes glinting with new confidence. "Now I finally get to enjoy high school." Dwayne let out a loud laugh, shaking his head. "That's my girl." And as the Charger sped down the sunlit Houston streets, Alyssa felt something shift deep in her chest. The heaviness she'd carried for so long, the fear, the pressure, the second-guessing. It all lifted like dust in the rearview mirror. She hadn't won by shouting the loudest, by being the strongest, or by playing his game dirtier than he did. She'd won by being smarter, by knowing when to wait, when to let him unravel all on his own. And Bryce Carter? he'd become exactly what he deserved to be: a cautionary tale, a reminder that fear-based power is always temporary, and that sometimes it's the quiet ones you should watch out for the most.